So tonight we're very lucky to be joined by Mathew Frith. He'll deliver his talk with the enigmatic title, Battles and Bluebells, A History of Sydenham Hill Wood. Mathew is an urban ecologist with a particular interest in the relationship between nature and society in towns and cities. He has 30 years experience of land management policy and practice in nature conservation, and has worked for organisations including English Nature and Peabody Housing Association. All his work has focused on developing and promoting better understanding of biodiversity conservation in urban areas, whether that's in private gardens, parks, housing estates, nature reserves, or even on buildings. Just pausing to admit some more people into the meeting. Mathew managed Sydenham Hill Wood between 1990 and 1996, and his current role is Director of Conservation at London Wildlife Trust, which is a role that sees him overseeing the management and development of the Trust's conservation work, developing the policy base to advocate the protection and creation and promotion of a wilder city, and furthering the Trust's research work. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mathew Frith. You should all be able to see his presentation there, hopefully.
Thank you, Sam, and good evening, everybody. When I agreed to this talk a couple of weeks ago, I rather rashly titled it A History of Sydenham Hill Wood. And when I started then digging into the archives, my archives, the Trust's archives, I rather rued the decision because there is mountains of stuff. They say that, or some people say that history is written by the victors. I would say in this case, the history is written by those who bothered to record anything and leave it in a place where others could find it. So I'm going to rush through a fairly large number of slides as quickly and as crisply as I can. Feel free to ask questions in the chat box. Or I'm going to try and leave some time at the very end for people to ask questions, primarily about what I bring up in the talk. This is very clearly a history of Sydenham Hill Wood. The history of Sydenham Hill Wood is yet to be written and will be far longer and far more comprehensive. And it is written very much through the prism of my time at the Wood, which is 5.5 years on site, but also time subsequently in my role at the Trust. I am one of, I think, 15 members of staff who've had a role in managing the Wood, and I think there's at least one other on the call this evening. Now I'm going to try and make this work. So very, very quickly, Sydenham Hill Wood is one of the relics of the Great North Wood, mixture of oak. I'm not going to go into the detailed history of the site itself, but we can look at it in various maps going back to the 18th century. So we've got John Roke's map from 1745 and another map from 1829 on the right there with a circle of an approximate location of the wood as it was then. And without going into the history of why that landscape changed, it's been promulgated through the Great North Wood Living Landscape Project. Fundamentally, in this part of the world, and I live in Sydenham, it was the construction of the Crystal Palace in 1852, 1854. Absolute leviathan of a building, dominating the landscape. And of course, there was new building that was built around it, Norwood Newtown, Upper Sydenham, etc. There was competition by railways to further and service the Crystal Palace. Firstly, London Brighton South Coast Railway, and then what became the London Chatham Dover Railway. And the railway cut through what was left of the woodland parts in 1864, opening 1865. And this is a shot in 1903 looking towards the nearby Lordship Lane station, which has long since gone and is now covered by Sydenham Hill Estate. And this is a photograph taken from Cox's Walk footbridge, the same bridge that in 1871 Camille Pissarro painted a picture of Lordship Lane Station. There's the footbridge as it was in 1910. And then looking southwards through the Peckerman's Wood Tunnel towards what was then Upper Sydenham Station. This was a photograph taken in the last year of the railway's operation in 1954. What the railway did and what the Crystal Palace furthered was the development on the upper slopes of Sydenham Hill, both on the east and the western sides of the ridge. And this is just one example of one of the huge villas that was built along the top ridge, and with very highly ornamental landscape gardens dropping down to the railway line side itself. There was further attractions built in the area with the Horniman Museum, and this is a photograph of the museum in 1914. And there's an association of the museum with the trust, because when I was working at the Wood, I was based at the museum itself. We had an office in the Natural History Department. So here we can see a map in 1916 with the railway cutting through, and as you can see, the woodland by then had been divided up into portions of gardens and buildings. The photograph on the right is was a beech grove, which was the last building to stand in this group of villas, demolished in about 1982. And there's a photograph there of the remaining lodge on the roadside in 1995. Beech Grove formed part of a little running saw on the site for a few years. Now, for those of you who know the site well, there are clearly remnants of that Victorian past, with the renowned Folly, built largely of brick and an early form of concrete called pulamite, and also the sort of vegetative relics of that garden past, such as the magnificent cedar of Lebanon. But there's also a Chilean pine or monkey puzzle tree. There's large numbers of yew trees which were planted in the gardens as well. And there is the legacy of multiple plantings of rhododendrons and cherry laurel, again, which were ornamental plantings from the Victorian times that survived through to the modern day. When the railway was closed and the track bed was starting to be built on in either side of Cox's Walk and the other side of the railway tunnel, this area was basically remaining untouched, but there were already ideas for its future. At the same time, 1981, a group of organisations and individuals convened at a school in Stoke Newington and founded what became London Wildlife Trust. And we set out a vision for the city at that time, which in the language is not this, although it's set out in the language of the early 1980s, is not dissimilar to the vision of the National Park City, which many of you will be familiar with. So we'd already set that out almost 40 years ago. And we were founded very much on a campaigning zeal, fundamentally around Sydenham Hill Wood. Because at that time, about 1980, Southwark Council were planning to build on a good tract of the remaining woodland at that time. And on the map on the right-hand side, you'll see the hatched area, where it's called Fernbank and Lapswood. They were already owned by Southwark Council and zoned for housing. And there was the Mid-South Southwark plan, which had been proposing this housing, and that led to a long-running campaign lasting a couple of years, both with the embryonic Wildlife Trust, but also the Sydenham Society, the Dullage Society, and other local amenity societies campaigning and objecting to those proposals. And they were eventually won. As you can see here, there was many, this is obviously pre-social media time, pre-internet time. Everything was done by leaflets, by notices on lampposts, letters in newspapers. notices in libraries, because that's how we communicated at that time. And there was a campaign that continued, because whilst that was eventually overturned and the wood was, we convinced Southwark Council that the wood should be turned into a nature reserve, we were granted permission to take on that management. Originally, there's a complex kind of evolution of small organisations together that came together. Initially, the Southwark Environment Trust, but then that became the Southwark Wildlife Group, that then became the arm of London Wildlife Trust in this part of town. And it was headed up by 3 key individuals. First was a councillor of Southwark Council, a guy called Bob Smythe, and then 2 local residents, Amrit Rowe and Lucy Neville. And they were the real driving force from the trust perspective in saving the wood and creating the foundations for the nature reserve that many of us enjoy and know today. This is one of the campaign protests at Southwark Town Hall in Peckham in the early 1980s, mixture of the Sydenham Society, and there's Amrit and Lucy down there at the bottom bottom left-hand corner, and other members of the trust staff there, all dressed in boughs of, I believe, holly and spotted cherry laurel, because that's the best thing to do with it, and convincing the council to take the right course of action at that time. But that didn't go away. Whilst the battle was won with Southwark Council, there was a portion of the wood, and I'll just go quickly back to this map, which you can see in the middle of the map, called Beech Grove. This was not owned by the council. It was owned by the estate governors of Dullage College, or the Dullage estate as they're known now. And they put forward a proposal to build a small estate on the footprint of the building that had been demolished in 1982. And in preparation for their proposal, they bulldozed part of the site in 1988. And that led to another campaign, which we and other local societies worked hard again to try and resist. Now, the image on the left is the original proposal of how the new block of flats would not interfere with the views from within the woodland by the landscape architects acting on behalf of the estate. But we won that first battle in 1989, and there's the press release where we thwarted that proposal. But that didn't go away. By the time I started in 1990, we were still running an appeal against another proposal to build a single building on Beech Grove, and that was quashed in 1991. Here's just an example of the publicity that we managed to achieve in the press. And as you can see there, if you can read it, it went national. And we had coverage in the Times and the Observer, etc., because this was a critical battle in the early stages of the urban nature conservation movement. Now, how did we win that battle? Well, we won that battle on the basis that we convinced the planning inspectorate that elements of the woodland, despite it being very much damaged and abused and changed by the coming of the railway and the building of the villas from the 1860s to the late 19th century, that elements of its ancient woodland character still persisted. Now, we had already been convinced the Greater London Council, which was the regional local authority at that time, to basically survey the whole of London to find out what was worth protecting, because at that time, very few sites in London as a whole enjoyed protection for their nature conservation value. They were the sites of special scientific interest, and there was about 12 of them in 1982. So we managed to convince the GLC to pay for the trust to survey the whole of London, and we had a team of 8 people working for 2 years, basically running around in a minibus, by bicycle, by train, by bus and by foot, armed with maps on paper and with coloured crayons in order to map the habitats which were surveyed. This is not obviously Sydenham or Dullage, this is Barking Riverside, but it gives you an example of how these maps were created with colour-coded areas according to the habitats that were recorded there. And that was backed up by sheets and sheets and sheets of paper with descriptions of those particular sites. Now, what happened with those bits of paper? Well, they got transformed by the work of what became the London Ecology Unit, which was one of the organisations that was created after the abolition of the Greater London Council in 1986. And I was actually involved in this work. I eventually started working for the for the London Ecology Unit, and was actually involved in the publication of this book. So all the survey data for Southwark was gathered and it was analysed, and then it was set out in a publication here, Nature Conservation in Southwark, with identifying sites according to their value. And you can see there in the circle in the map that M75 is Dullage and Sydenham Hill Woods. And this is an M, which means it is of metropolitan importance. So it is of regional value because largely of its ancient woodland character. And it has enjoyed that value ever since. It also is protected through metropolitan open land and the fact that it's in a conservation area, which is designated for its architectural and landscape value within the Southwark local plan. None of this, of course, means it is sacrosanct in terms of its protection, but it enjoys levels of protection according to the threats or the potential impacts upon it. Now we know that and we knew then that the woodland had value. It had been surveyed by a well-known botanist called Edward Lousley in 1958 and 1959, and these are basically interpretations of his notes that our team undertook in the early 80s, trying to work out where his descriptions related to the parts of the wood. And then in 1984, the Greater London Council basically undertook what was known as, was still known as, the Ancient Woodland Inventory. So this is a national inventory of ancient woodland, and the Greater London area was surveyed in 1984. And this is just one portion of that survey, and showing you that parts of the map here in terms of their sections called 9.8 and 9B, 8A, etc. And there's a lot of description underneath this, which basically suggests that there is enough here for it to be classified as ancient woodland. There's also a very interesting survey undertaken by the Dullage Society in 1971 of all the trees and shrubs within the wood. Now, there are over 2,000 individual trees recorded on this map. It is in colour, but this is the black and white version, which was the only thing I was managing to scan before our scanner broke during the week. And you can see there on the key on the left, the level of detail that this goes into. It talks about 450 mature rhododendrons, over 300 oaks, etc. It's so big I can't really show it on any more than one screen, but it gives you an idea of the level of surveying that was being carried out before we had digital technology to hand. So, just to remind ourselves, ancient woodland, very important in protecting the site. And there was further mapping undertaken by the Trust when we started work there in the positions of what are known as ancient woodland indicator species. These are primarily plants. There's a lot more work that's been undertaken subsequently looking at animals and fungi, but these were the kind of indicator species that were used at that particular time. So we've got wood anemone and bluebell, and shown in particular parts of the site. And then you can also look at the impact of the railway on common violet and wood sage, which are known as woodland ride species. They are found on the edges of woodlands where there is a lot more light. And unsurprisingly, they were found at that time, they're still found at the wood in these particular places on the areas which get sunshine during the middle of the day. So some early publications from the Trust. We'd already compiled what information we knew of the site from various sources in 1983-84. And then there's a document here from 87 looking at how we might survey and monitor the wildlife of the reserve from that time. And that has formed a lot of the work that has been subsequently undertaken. And I see there are people on this call who do surveys for us at the moment, particularly, for example, birds. We were beginning to look at things more than the plants, though, because plants are easy to survey because they stay relatively still. They don't move quickly, although I had most of our primroses nicked in the winter of 1991. But we can see here we were starting to work with our volunteers, and as Sam mentioned at the start, whilst there has been 15 dedicated members of staff for the wood, there has been probably at least 2,000, if not more, volunteers who have been involved in the woodland management over the last 35 years or so. And they're, they are involved, have been involved in all kinds of work, whether it's practical work, cutting out rhododendron or cherry laurel, maintaining the paths, installing, replacing, repairing fencing, gates, signage, etc., undertaking surveys, but also looking at other species that are found within the area. And this is just an example of something that we carried out in 1994. It was because I had been looking at the work of what was known as one of the earliest lepidopterists, a guy called Moses Harris, who had published the Aurelian, a big book on insects that he'd found in and around London in 1766. And he reports seeing purple hair streaks, a butterfly found pretty much around large mature oak trees, from what was called Oak of Honour Hill, near Peckham in Surrey. And he records taking them aplenty. Now, Oak of Honour Hill is One Tree Hill as we know it today. So on that basis, we decided to survey as many of the Great North Woodland sites to see whether purple hair streaks were still there, because nobody had looked for them since that time. And lo and behold, we found them, particularly at places like Beulah Heights, Bigham Wood, and at Dullage Wood. But of course, that then triggered a lot more survey work that was undertaken in the 1990s and the 2000s. So these are just some examples of the reports that were published and undertaken, often by specialist entomologists in this particular case, but also setting out the foundations of how we would monitor our birds from mid-1990s. And then that's been replicated by increasing sort of technological means. So this is just an example of blackbird territories recording a couple of years ago. But it's not just about the biodiversity as well. It's also looking at the other impacts of what goes on in an urban nature reserve, because from the outset, London Wildlife Trust was founded on the principle that people should have free access to nature, and that you didn't have to become an august member of a society that could reel off 400 names in Latin before you were allowed in, or you had to pay an entry fee to get into one of our nature reserves. So Sydenham Hill Wood is free to access, but of course that comes with a cost. From the outset, Sydenham Hill Wood was a popular site to visit, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in due course. But already in the 80s, we've got some studies already being undertaken at the wood, looking at the impacts of soil erosion and habitat destruction. Now, one thing that I just want to make clear is that the wood, whilst it had been fenced since it had been closed from the railways closure, and the Southwark Council buying the land with the intent on building on most of it, it had been used as a de facto place for people to play, to walk their dogs, to ride their bikes, to joyride in terms of motorbikes and cars, all the way through the 1960s and 70s. So there were holes in the fence which people used to walk through, or jemmy their way in, or vault over. And of course there was a lot of what might be described as antisocial behaviour at that time, but may have just been people enjoying themselves without causing too much concern, because this was a place that was largely out of sight and out of mind to many people. But as you can see here from the report on the right, and apologies for this sort of blurred image, because as I said, our scanner broke earlier this week, we were having relatively high levels of vandalism in the 1980s and 1990s. I can say that it got so bad in the late 80s that one of my predecessors basically gave up the job, and he left because he was spending too much time either dealing with things just being trashed, burnt, spray painted, or being threatened by basically young people, that he sort of gave in. So even through the 1990s, I think that was starting to decline, but we were still getting elements of that. And this was a study undertaken by one of our volunteers at the time, who was also looking at other ways of helping organisations try and address vandalism. Now, just a little bit on evolution of signage. So this is the only image I can find of the first sign that we put up in typical creative style, should we say. There's no hint of corporate nature in there. Just been painted on a bit of wood. This was probably, I think, 1983. We'd moved into our new offices in the Westway and in West London. Soon after, 1984, we moved into offices in King's Cross, and we can see some elements there of vandalism with shotgun pellets. So it's the kind of thing that often went on at that time. We're still sporting our first logo, which is of a wren against the tower of St Paul's Cathedral. Visual pun, of course, which eventually had to change because I think the Wren Society, who promote the story of Sir Christopher Wren, weren't too pleased, but there we go. And this is just an example of what the entrance was like. The wood was surrounded by corrugated zinc fencing sheets all the way until a few years later. And the initial work was about trying to create a open fencing which you could look into, but also that there were the beginnings of gating and steps to create the foundations of our access. And we've got three important people here. So Gary Grant, who was one of the first wardens, who's on the left-hand side on both pictures. Amrit, who was one of the founding volunteers, helping to sort of spearhead the campaign to save the site on the right-hand side. And what I think is Patrick, but again, I need confirmation of this because nobody has been very good at labelling our old images, who was also one of the early members of staff. And this is at the Cox's Walk end of the wood. And looking, so this is looking effectively down Cox's Walk on the right-hand side there. And this is looking into the woods at Cox's Walk on one of the new signs that was put in not 1993, but that's when the photograph was taken, but in 1988, with our new logo, what I call the radioactive shadow of a fox against a wall. At Crescentwood Road, that is the entrance as it was in 2012. The original entrance actually went down a set of steps on the right-hand side, literally cutting right across the path, as you can see, going in here. The path here was put in by me and a group of volunteers in about 1993, where we took a more gentle incline. It's always been a bit of a struggle, this tight entrance at Crescentwood Road, but the set of steps that went down beforehand were literally lethal. So we destroyed those and created this ramp. We also installed some containers, and this is what I call a grand opening of the container with the cutting of a ribbon in 1988. It was originally set out to be a kind of nature study centre, but for those of you who are familiar with the wood, and that particular part of the wood by the tunnel entrance will know it is the dampest, coldest part of the site, and where everything of a wooden nature rots pretty quickly. And so after a couple of years, the idea of a nature study centre was basically ditched, and it became a store. And for those of you who know the site now, know that that storage container has been extended. But it's still, the big one is still the same one. There it was. No, I think it was replaced a few years ago. So that could be corrected if somebody wishes to correct me on that. So this is some early members of staff. We've got Barry Nicholson on the left. He was one of the key members of staff in terms of surveys and nature conservation knowledge. We've got John Archer with his back towards us, who was one of our field officers working for the borough, across the borough for the trust. And then we've got Bob Young, who was one of my predecessors, who was the one who was involved in the early sort of work in creating the pond, but was the one who I think struggled with a lot of the vandalism and left in 1989. This is some of the stuff that we're doing in the early 80s. We were clearing the wood with all the crap that had been dumped there in over 2 decades. So here's a nice example of a Renault being dragged out, waiting to be picked up by a lorry. We're also beginning to create ponds. So this is the pond being created, the small pond in Sydenham Hill Wood rather than the Dewey pond in Dullage Wood in 1984, and that's Barry there overseeing the work of, I think it might have been Jeff, who was our first sort of conservation officer working at central office. You can see here how the wood has changed. So this is the Crescentwood or Peckham's Wood tunnel. We put new fencing up at the top there to prevent people from falling off if they so decided to go up around there. And you can see that the old walkway from the Crescentwood Road entrance down to the tunnel mouth did not go behind the tunnel at all. It came down a fairly ergonomically weird set of steps, which we decided to rip up in 1993, as I said, and take the path round the back of the tunnel and coming in by the Peckham's Wood entrance. It is less steep to climb up, but even though that it is still not particularly ergonomically brilliant. This is Sydenham Hill, the main road along the top, and you can give you an idea of the fencing as there were 1985. Once we'd started to remove the zinc sheeting, this is what was behind, and this was eventually replaced. Between Sydenham Hill Wood, though, and the large block of Dullage Wood was the boundary fencing that split the 2 ownerships. So many people who come into the wood today, and certainly probably over the last 25 years, can't really see the distinction between the 2. But they are different, they have different ownerships. And this was the fence that I looked at when I started in 1990. And we'd already started a discussion with the Dullage estate to remove this fencing. and replace it with a set of bollards. So those of you who know the site today may remember or recall or know of little green bollards that remain between the two sites. They effectively and Dullage wood. When they were originally installed, they were painted white. For those of you who know Dullage village, there's a lot of white posts around the village, and obviously the estate at that time thought that was the appropriate treatment. We convinced them to paint them green. But to all intents and purposes, to most visitors, it is one wood, and it's been a long-term ambition to manage the woodlands as a single complex rather than three bits, if we think of Dullage Wood, Sydenham Hill Wood and Cox's Walk. And I'm not even forgetting here Beech Grove, which was still at that time owned by the Dullage estate. Eventually in 2005, we managed to get funding from what was then called the Heritage Lottery Fund to replace all the external fencing along Crescentwood Road, Sydenham Hill, and then down Cox's Walk right through to, basically right through to the halfway down Cox's Walk. This cost, I think, something like £100,000 to give you an idea of just how much money it took and why it took us so long to replace it with fencing that we actually wanted, because it was just so costly. Moving into some of the interpretation. So, you know, what does a nature conservation organisation do? It basically publishes leaflets to tell people what we were doing and what you might find there. So our first nature trail leaflet, a management leaflet describing what we were doing, because what we weren't doing is just basically putting a nice fence around the wood, creating a few paths and letting nature take her own course, because it would have been overcrowded with rhododendron, bramble, holly and other species. So we had to maintain that diverse mix. Our second nature trail leaflet from 1988. And then the long-term ambition was to declare the site as a local nature reserve. Without going into the complexities of the legislation, there is what's known as the 1949 Act, which under section 22 or something like that, gives the local authorities the powers to declare land for the study of nature and for the protection and conservation of nature. Now, ironically, if you actually look at the details of this, it doesn't cover the whole site. And if you go onto the Natural England information, it will say that it's Sydenham Hill Wood and Fernbank, which is the local nature reserve. Fernbank being one of the old Victorian villa garden sites. I published the leaflet for the local nature reserve, describing what the purpose of the LNR designation meant. And then we went into producing leaflets about some of the biodiversity that you could find in the wood at that time. We then also decided to redraw the maps that we've been utilising at that time and shifting them from a north-south direction to an east-west direction, and basically using a bird's eye view of the site as a more, hopefully, easier way for people to navigate around the site. And as you can see here, we've tried to populate it with a wooded kind of feel to it. You may note the Chilean pine or monkey puzzle tree between points 1 and 2, the folly at point 4, and 3, which we haven't marked, is the kind of damp hollow or crater by the cedar of Lebanon, of course, which all still exist. That became transformed in our first 4-colour leaflet, which we published in 1992. And as you can see, there are 2 areas of the wood which weren't formally under our management. So not only Beech Grove, that Lapswood, we were reminded of at that time by the council, was still not formally part of the nature reserve, although we were effectively managing it. And that map then evolved over time into signage that we put up. here in the early 2000s, and then in about 2005, and you'll notice a new logo had been adopted by that time. So in 1995, we threw away the radioactive fox and adopted the Wildlife Trust's cross-eyed badger. This is the first interpretation of it. And then secondly, we slipped in London, slightly elongated version of that logo. And this is the sign, I believe, at Crescentwood Road. And we started doing things in a way that we hadn't done before. We started to sort of promote the woodland in a way to a much broader audience. If you can imagine the 1980s, or think of the 1980s as about fighting the battles and establishing the principle of the nature reserve, getting and establishing volunteer teams and staff in place to manage that site, start the process of surveying the site for its biodiversity. The 90s was as much about promoting the site to a broader audience. Now, that was partly because the land was owned by Southwark Council. We were being funded by Southwark Council as a public local authority, and the land was public open space. So it had to be for the public. And this is just one example. The Southwark Woodland Festival that I was actively involved in over a course of 2 days in 1993. A picture of me with a kestrel as an example, but we had, I think, about 1,000 people. We also managed to get the Young's Brewery dray coming up with their horse carrying children up Cox's Wall as an example of the activities that we undertook at that time. And we had a band playing in the tunnel mouth as an example of some, well, not just one band, we had a lot of music at that time, as examples of giving people the opportunity to experience a different thing in a nature reserve. And you know, I'm not saying this happened or was necessarily embraced by everybody. There were views at that time that nature reserves should only be for people to study nature and not to do other things. Hopefully we've moved on from that particular point of view, but there are still challenges there. Another example was Acer Pseudoplatinus, which for many of you will know is the scientific name or Latin name for sycamore. I quite like sycamore, and it was a bit of a rebuttal at that time because I had grown up as an ecologist learning that sycamore was almost the devil's spawn, and it was a plant that had to be rooted out at all opportunity. And there were some conservation organisations seemingly focusing on doing nothing but removing sycamore. Now, if you know what sycamore is, and you know, it's a Northern European tree that basically missed the boat when Britain became an island from mainland Europe, and it adapts very well to the kind of conditions that we've got in southern Britain. It is an honorary native, and it is plentiful in Sydenham Hill Wood, and in many areas is not really causing much of a problem. But this was an artist installation. It was an idea posed to me by somebody walking around the woods who I got to know, and she said, I want to host an installation across the site. So that's what we did. Over a weekend in November '93, all these artists, maybe shouldn't include myself there, basically created installations in various parts of the wood. On the night of the 5th of November, we basically lit up the whole of the wood with candles in habitat paper bags dotted all around the wood, and people could visit each installation, which is all lit by LED lights. And we had mulled wine, and people could experience the woodland at night. And that was just another example of one of the installations. There was an old way of trapping moths, was putting sugar solution on trees. So this was just an interpretation of that. And we continue that work. So this is two artists, I can remember their first names, Giles and Mark, basically making use of trees that we had felled in the wood, mainly because they were dangerous. This was a huge copper beech that had been continually burnt by people thinking it was a good laugh, then followed up by fungal attack. And this was so big, this tree, that if it had fallen, it would have killed anybody underneath it. So we took the decision to fell it, and then whilst most of it slowly rotted, these two artists who were from the University of East London came in with for a residency over 2 weeks, creating bits out of that wood. Here's an example of one of those, and it got a fair amount of flack. People weren't comfortable with these two guys basically working with chainsaws and adzes and axes, creating things which eventually were going to rot away. That was the whole point. It was temporary art, and whilst people might not have liked what they did, it was not going to be permanent. That continued into the 2000s under the auspices of one of my successors, Ian Holt. Two examples here: the art of permanence and change, and eco-vandalism. Again, fairly provocative things using kind of contemporary conceptual art. I remember going to see a fantastic film of kind of simulating the trains coming in out of the tunnel as an example of two of those. Those continued through things right until the early 2010s. This was an example that was a proposal. I don't think it actually happened because, again, there were always problems. And what's happened over the last 20 years is that local authorities themselves have become a lot more, shall we say, constraining and regulatory in what they will allow and the permissions that we need in terms of licenses in order to hold things where the public may gather. I'm going to cut now to the work. Probably a symbolic start here would be the 1987 Great Storm, which hit southeast England. For those of you who recall it, 15 million trees were blown down in a single night. A few people were killed, a lot of livestock were killed, and a lot of damage was done in the aftermath by contractors working on the cheap and nasty, shall we say, clearing out trees without thought of what they were doing in terms of the damage, either removing fantastic resource of dead wood or taking in big machinery to churn up the land in order to grab the timber out and then sell it. We did something differently. We got 2 Ardennes horses in and dragged the timber out as a kind of environmentally light way of doing so. And this photograph was actually featured on the front page of the Times to give you an example of, we weren't short of promoting what we were doing. We were, of course, having to demonstrate what we were doing and recording what we were doing in management. There's no point just managing a site without taking note of what you're doing. And that's a way of monitoring whether you're having an impact over time. So these are just 2 examples of a map I inherited from 1990 and then a map I created in 1991-92. And it just gives you, again, examples here of step repairs, tree planting, ditch clearance, handrail erection, Japanese knotweed removal, as where these were the tasks that we were planning ahead for that particular year. Things happen though. Even after the storm, we had another storm in 1990 and then trees collapsing into Cox's Walk footbridge, and then the work that was undertaken to remove those. Cox's Walk has had its own focus. It was renovated again in 2003, 4, 5, being timbers replaced and repainted. But as I said, a lot of the work has only been possible by dedicated bands of volunteers. And, you know, my thanks to those who worked with me over the 5.5 years, obviously repeated by my successors right to the current day. That work cannot be done without them. I think what you find has changed is that, shall we say, the requirements of health and safety are much more onerous now than they ever were. You can't see any PPE there at all. I think there is a pair of gloves there, but there were no hard hats, there were no visors, there was no protective trousers at all. I basically asked people to turn up with robust boots. They had the tools talk and all that kind of stuff, but I would say that it was a little bit, shall we say, a little less regimented than it is now. And it's apologies to my colleagues now who are undertaking this work, but we just didn't do it. We just got on with the work. Work wasn't always in the sunshine though. Yeah, for those of us who had to sort of gather in the winter, it could be hideously cold. But you know, I think only in the course of 5 years, we abandoned only 2 work days. One because it was just so cold and snowing, one was torrential downpour. But, you know, we're a rugged lot, I think, at Sydenham Hill Wood, and that continues to this day. So it's all kinds of work. You know, here it's planting a hedge, the upper end of Cox's Walk. This is, I think, in 2013, 14, with Daniel, one of my successors. And next to him on the ground is probably the longest serving volunteer, Ernie Thomason. He was there before me and he'll be there after me. Still going strong and dedicated to the wood and to the Great North Wood team. My hat's off to him even though I'm not wearing one. Another example here, clearing trees that have come down by wind, again in Cox's Walk. There's a lot of Cox's Walk photographs in this history, but that's because it tends to photograph quite well. A bit of a contentious point in this moment in time, I believe, but we do have, because one of the things that's happened over the course of the last 35 years is the wood has become far busier. When I started at Sydenham Hill Wood, we estimated there were about 30,000 visits a year. It was by far the most popular of the London Wildlife Trust reserves. By the time I left the Trust for the first time in 2000, I think we were estimating 80,000 visitors coming to the woods. Now, Sam, our current site manager, told me or emailed me this week saying that the electronic counters that we have now, because in those days we didn't have any means to count people, it was just kind of anecdotal and finger in the air using various kind of times of the year to sort of count people over the time that you were spending on the site. We now have electronic gates where we count people coming in, and he has recorded this week 315,000 visits this year. Now that's not visitors, that's visits, but it gives you an idea that the impact of people coming into the wood has risen significantly. And of course, it's not just people on their own, it's people with dogs. And I'm not going to get into a contentious issue on this moment, at this particular moment, but dog ownership has dramatically risen in the last 10 years. It's more than doubled since the 1960s in Britain. And dogs have their own impacts on nature reserves, either in terms of what they leave in nature reserves, although conscientious dog walkers obviously take most of that away, apart from those who tend to hang their bags in the trees, but also because of the disturbance to birds and other wildlife. And so fences have been put up to protect the most sensitive areas of the site, particularly because of the flora. And I have to say that when I started at the wood, we had no areas of internal fencing, but that has obviously changed because of those impacts. We've had to get funding, and when we get funding, we have to bring in, obviously, people to demonstrate that we are doing the right thing. This is the late David Bellamy on the left-hand side there in the red. I'm afraid I'm the other one in the red, with a camera crew and with basically somebody from the grant funder wanting to demonstrate that their money is going to a good thing. This is a bit of a shoddy bit of work here, I have to say, trying again to prevent trampling of an area which you wouldn't recognise now. So where this photograph is being taken from is now completely wooded, because we had to plant it up. I'm not a fan of tree planting myself, I prefer natural regeneration, but we just had to protect this slope from being completely eroded. So with barriers on both the top and the bottom and planting, that site has been completely changed. The woodland is fantastic, and many people will be familiar with many different parts of it, and there's a differing character. This is on the boundary between Dullage and Sydenham Hill Wood, with a lot of even-aged oaks, most of which were probably planted in the early part of the 20th century. And what you'll notice is very little regeneration because of the canopy so dark. So what you've seen, partly through the Great North Wood project, is areas have been fenced off in this part of the wood to encourage regeneration by preventing trampling by people going through it, because as people come through the Crescentwood Road, sorry, the Cox's Walk entrance here, they fan out. And that makes it much more difficult for oak saplings, for example, to survive. We have fantastic trees, which are relics from the past. This is right on the edge of the railway. And it was the favourite tree of one of my predecessors, Bob Young. There's a photograph of him in the Observer, but I couldn't find the edition to show you of that. And we don't have these anymore in the wood. These are two of the last remaining railway poplars that were planted by the railway company in the 1860s. Now, railway poplar is a select, what it's called a cultivar of the native black poplar, Populus nigra, stroke canadensis, and it was known as the railway poplar because it could deal with smoke pollution from the steam engines, and also could cope with the regular haircuts it got through the pollarding. These trees survived until the late 1990s, perhaps the early 2000s. No longer there. They were stood by the glade in the middle of the site. And a lot of our work was also about actively bringing people into the site through education work and through events. So I've showed you the festival sites, but this is just an example for me in 1993 with a group of young people from the Max Roach Adventure Playground in Brixton. And we made a particular effort to attract and bring people who wouldn't normally at that time visit those sites, because they didn't feel welcome in places like this. They didn't feel these places were for them. And so there's been a strong part of the Trust's work ever since we were founded to tackle this issue of disconnection, this issue of legitimacy for anybody to access our sites. That has evolved over time. So this is a kind of family gathering that we get on the sites in the summer, partly because the sites have become a lot more popular. And of course, something which I've noticed over the time is that the demographic of Sydenham Hill Wood has changed, particularly in and around East Dullage and Forest Hill. And also the attractions have changed. So whilst Crystal Palace has long since gone, there's a very important watering hole at the top of Sydenham Hill called the Dullage Woodhouse. Now, when I was working at the Wood, there was still what was known as Sunday opening hours for pubs, which means they opened at 11 o'clock in Sundays and they shut at 2. They reopened at 6:30. The Dullage Woodhouse was not a gastro pub, as some of us may call it now. It wasn't a family pub where you would go and have a meal. It's where you had a few pints and you played darts. It was a locals pub, as some of us might call it at that time. But that changed in the late 1990s as the Sunday opening hours changed, and that became a new draw for people to the woods coming up through Cox's Walk, or from Dullage itself through Grange Lane, and then going from Mill in Dullage, and the Dullage Woodhouse, and then coming out afterwards. And that continues to this day. Nice shot of the wood in 2009, the winter. There's the second container that was installed to add to our capacity. New fencing went up because Sydenham Hill Wood, Southwark Council were worried about liabilities of access to the tunnel. So this hideous thing went up in the mid-2000s. That then became plastered with panelling because it was broken into. But we got somebody to paint a mural on it in 2016. And a fantastic piece of art reflecting the work that Ian Holt had undertaken and his crew in the early 2000s in terms of bats, and eventually getting bat roosts, bat boxes installed within the wood. And it's now a licensed bat roost for brown long-eared bats. A lot of the work renovating the graffiti on the containers. There's a shot of what the tunnel looks like from inside. Some of us in the early days had free access into the wood. At one stage, it was proposed to become a shooting range. And there were also proposals, which occasionally get renovated every so often, for this to be opened up as a cycle path, which we would resist strongly because of the further encroachment and damage on the woodland, let alone the bat roost itself. And those bats are monitored on a monthly, on an annual basis. This isn't a long-eared, brown long-eared bat, for example. We have numerous bat boxes around the site which were first installed in the late 1990s. An example of some of the attractions we bring in some of our open days, pole lathe. We have wildflower talks. We have science activities here rooting around on the woodland floor in terms of a bug search. Our most popular activities basically are either fungi forays or bat walks, an example here from 2011, often attracting 80 to 100 people. Birds of prey, always a draw. This is another wildflower walk with Mark Spencer, who was at the Natural History Museum at the time. This is another open day. I'm just running through now because beginning to run out of time. This is a bat and moth event, again very, very popular with one of my successors, Ashley. And then a shot over the Great North Wood, the remnants of that from Counterbury House in 2000. I know it's 2000 because there was a brief glimpse of Canary Wharf, but this is pre-Shard days. Now, to come to an end here is the fact that we've always thought of Sydenham Hill Wood as just one part of a jigsaw of a historic landscape, the Great North Wood. Lucy Neville, who I mentioned early on as one of the kind of driving forces of getting the wood saved and established, published the Great North Wood on behalf of the Trust in 1987, this booklet, and there was a map within that. Now we took that as a kind of a germ to nourish and to further. And in 1993, we published a booklet on the Great North Wood, because there was which only if you opened your eyes and climbed to the highest points you could get a sense was still here. This is a shot from one of the top of the flats in Norbury Park, looking towards the Crystal Palace Ridge. We formed the Friends of Great North Wood in March 1993, and these are the two local MPs, Jim Dow, Lewisham West, and Tessa Jow for Dullage and West Norwood, planting a ceremonial oak at Sydenham Hill Wood at that time. The Trust basically supported the Friends of the Great North Wood, and we set and published a newsletter called The Wood Warbler, running into about 26 issues to the early 2000s, which was not only talking about what was going on in Sydenham Hill Wood, but across the Great North Wood area, which Sam described at the very outset. I was working at the museum, and we convinced the museum to hold an exhibition with some of their natural history department, and that was in 1995. And that was then led us to create these maps, which have formed the foundation for our work ever since. There's an example again of the leaflet, and that's some publicity in some local papers. We then went and produced another leaflet with Tessa again launching it, and this was commemorating the old railway route, because if with a bit of searching you could still walk along much of the route and in a green route way. And we described that with the Cockney slang of the Crystal Palace Railway, the Nun's Head to the Screaming Alice, as the Crystal Palace was called by people in the early 20th century. And we mapped out a route that you can walk from Nunhead Station through Brenchley Gardens, diverting up to One Tree Hill, into Camberwell Old Cemetery, through Horniman Gardens, through Sydenham Hill Wood, through the remnants of Upper Sydenham Station, Hillcrest Estate Wood, and then into Crystal Palace Park, eventually on the old railway route. We then pushed that softly, and then that was taken up by others and led to the extension of the Green Chain Walk. Now, the Green Chain Walk was first set out in the 1970s from Erith in London Borough of Bexley to Crystal Palace Park, and then the work that we set out in the 1990s eventually saw fruition with the completion of the Green Chain Walk through to Nunhead Cemetery, and then onwards, in fact, through to the Thames in 2010. And this is one of the signposts at the Cox's Walk, Sydenham Hill Wood junction. Unfortunately, the Green Chain Walk, in my view, has some hideous mapping created out of steel, but they are kind of easy to navigate if you are of poor sight. We also looked at other sites in the area. So Sydenham Hill Station, a site of borough importance for nature conservation, in a sort of wooded embrace, and we worked with Railtrack to set this up as a nature reserve, not for public access because of particular, obviously, safety concerns. And this was launched in 1998 as part of the work that we were doing with Railtrack at that time. But unfortunately, for reasons I can't really divulge at this moment in time, but not helped by Railtrack being abolished early in 2000s because of the Hatfield rail disaster, that never came off. We also set up another nature reserve at the Salehurst Railway Triangle. We were pushing our work into our neighbouring boroughs, again setting the grounds for the Great North Wood project. We were advised for One Tree Hill, for Cox's Walk and Dullage Wood. And we were working on Cox's Walk, which had started in the 1990s by laying a new hedge. Working in Dullage Wood, a bit of a fuzzy picture here, by restoring the Dewey Pond in 2011 and 12. So that's it being dug out because it was basically a glorified dog bath. Here being planted up, and then here after that planting had been completed. And it's been one of the success stories for Dullage Wood, and again, an important stepping stone in bringing the Dullage estate into the narrative, shall we say. The most recent piece of work in terms of the jigsaw, this is the frontage on Sydenham Hill itself, the road. This is the frontage of Beechgrove. And in 2016, we signed a lease with the Dullage estate to hand over this site to the Wood, to the trust to become part of the Wood. So going back to that map, the bit of the jigsaw that we completed was Beechgrove in 2016. After we finally thwarted that site from being built on in 1995, with the Unitary Development Plan public appeal, the public inquiry, which basically ruled out development on that site. London today is 47% green and blue in terms of vegetation, open green space and blue space, which is your rivers and open water and lakes and reservoirs. And the Great North Wood Living Landscape Project is a way of trying to boost the quality of that green space and, where possible, the quantity of that green space. And I'm not going to steal Sam and his colleagues' thunder on this through this festival, but obviously that work continues both within Sydenham Hill Wood here as one of the Great North Wood Festivals in 2018, celebrating some of the beasts and the biodiversity which these sites are so important for. I'm going to finish off very quickly that our work continues much in the way that it's done for 35 years. So here is a tree walk by Daniel in 2017. Here is a tree walk by me in 1992. The only thing is then we didn't have high vis vests to distinguish us from our visitors. Our messages are very similar then. We're using obviously emojis nowadays. We didn't have that thing in the 1990s. And I want to come back to bluebells because I mentioned them at the start, but here is a quote from Common Wayside Flowers, published in 1860, referring to the bluebells of the Dullage woods, as they were then known. Sydenham Hill Wood is a modern appellation of the site. It was the Dullage woods right up until the railway started to carve them up. Oh. And then very quickly to finish off with, there have been some things changing on the biodiversity front. I've very consciously really not talked about the biodiversity. One would have thought that might have been the case for a nature reserve, but a nature reserve is a human construct. It's a thing that we do. Things have changed. So lesser spotted woodpeckers were breeding in Sydenham Hill Wood when I started, as were spotted flycatchers. They no longer do so. I recorded and photographed an Amazonian parrot in the wood in 1994, obviously an escaped pet. Spent a few days eating all the cherries. I didn't know of ringneck parakeets in 1990. They started appearing in the early 2000s, and of course across the whole of London now. But more excitingly, things are returning. So hobbies bred in the wood in 2015, and jackdaws, which last bred in the Dullage woods in about the 1950s, are back again too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Can everyone join me in a virtual round of applause for Matthew there? That was fantastic. A real deep dive into the Sydenham Hill Wood archive. Great to see all those old photos of the wood and see how those habitats have changed. And also to see everyone in their cool 90s garms. We've got a little bit of time for some questions. There's some that have come through on the chat. One from Joe Downey, which you did partially answer, I think. Has species diversity and abundance held steady or declined since it became a reserve? Who have been the winners and losers? Is there any concern about the trends being seen? And I guess I'd like to add to that, sort of, in terms of the habitats that you've seen, in terms of your sort of view of the wood over the last, well, since the 80s, have you seen the habitats change at all?
In short, yes. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The real messages change rather than necessarily decline, and I used some examples there in terms of the birds. There are two main reasons. One is we have to recognise that the trust is part of a wider sector of nature conservation, which goes through its own evolution of ideas supported by new research and evidence and best practice. And there are things that change in terms of fashions. So I referenced how sycamore was seen as a bête noire in the 1980s. And also that there is assumptions that things would happen in a certain way. So, for example, when I started, it was that woodlands had to be coppiced, because that's how most woodlands used to be managed when they were traditionally managed for firewood or wood for building, timber for buildings and fence work or whatever. So coppice with standards. There was a radical paper published in 1995 by, I can't remember their full name, so it's called Hambler and Spate, which was suggesting that we should stop managing woodlands as if they're part of the old countryside. If we're managing them for biodiversity, then we need to manage them for biodiversity and let nature take her own course. Because managing woodlands for coppicing benefits particular species which are adapted to that particular management regime. It's not particularly good for ferns, it's not particularly good for mollusks, it's not particularly good for liverworts or mosses, or for a range of other invertebrates which like damp and shade. So that's one thing. The other thing is that those of us who've worked at the woodlands have our own passions. We have our own interests. We have our own things that we like. I, after 5 years, realised that the wood was trying to tell me something. And I withdrew from a lot of active work in terms of management and focusing very much just on the path network, because that's where the real pressure was on people. My successor, a guy called John, had come up through forestry, and he liked cutting trees down because he thought that's what foresters did. And of course, our management plan gives flexibility in terms of that. His successor, Ian, was interested in bats, and he may refute this, but therefore his focus was looking on trying to conserve the bat population. Daniel's focus was on fungi and trees, so it was about celebrating that. So whilst we are monitoring things and surveying things, it's very difficult to really detect what those changes are. My own view is that there have been changes because of the sheer weight of people. And I think there is, an argument that perhaps the wood has been a victim of its own success. That poses challenges for us in terms of whether we put more fencing up or restrict access, which will be very difficult to do because it's a public open space. But these are the big challenges going forward. Sorry, it's a bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but if you want a bit more detail on that, then I can send something out via Sam or directly after today.
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, if anyone would be interested in getting that, just drop us a line at greatnorthwood@wildlondon.org.uk and we can forward some more information to you there. We had another question. Is there anything, any literature on the Great North Wood around at the moment? Ernie has messaged in the chat saying he still has copies of the Great North Wood and None Head to Screaming Alice leaflets, the original 90s ones, for £1. And I don't know where you can get those at the moment, but Ernie puts up his stall often at our events, so those are sometimes available. But also we've got the Chris Schuler's book, The Wood That Built London, which will be a history of the Great North Wood, and that's coming out next year. So that'll be a really interesting book all about the history of the Great North Wood. What
we should be doing, and I have called for it, is we should get those 2 leaflets put up on the website before they get replaced by an updated version, because there's no reason why they shouldn't be.
Yeah,
that's a good idea.
That's a really good idea.
Yeah, they
are around. Even I've got a few hard copies as well. Just but we can digitally scan them and get them up there.
Yeah, we can quite easily.
And we should also do that for Lucy Neville's book, because has dated in some cases, and there are some points which got us into a little bit of trouble, I'll say. I think those times have passed.
And was it someone mentioned that you can still see copies of that book, the Lucy Neville pamphlet about the Great North Wood, sorry, I've missed a bit in the library. Croydon Libraries hold copies of that, of the 1980s Great North Wood booklet.
I think they're also in the Southwark Reference Library in London Bridge as well.
Okay. Bruno asks, are there still threats to encroachment on the woods from development? Any chance of extending the woods into the golf course?
Well, that's been one of my ambitions. For those who know me, they know I'm not a particular fan of golf courses. I think they're a very wasteful use of green space in a crowded city. And that even more so applies in the Greenbelt. But that's my personal view. That's not the Trust's formal position. I think there are opportunities to utilise parts of the playing fields and the golf course to extend slightly the wood. That's one of the ambitions of the Great North Wood in the longer term. I think the wood is fairly well protected in terms of development, partly because precedence has been set by previous public inquiries. It's been through 4 public inquiries now, both from the Southwark Council initial proposals and those from the Dullage estate back in the 80s and 90s. As I said, it's metropolitan open land, it's conservation area, it's a metropolitan site of importance for nature conservation. We're currently in discussion with the council over a further layer of protection, but I can't reveal what that is at the moment because it hasn't been at all agreed. Unfortunately, we don't think the site would merit a site of special scientific interest. It is simply not valuable enough in that respect. It is on the Ancient Woodland Inventory, which is being reviewed at this moment in time, and I don't think that would change. So, Ancient Woodland does enjoy a level of protection up and beyond most other woodlands in London. So I'm fairly confident in that respect of its protection from development.
Thank you, Matthew. And I think we'll call it a night there. So another huge thanks to Matthew there for that amazing talk, and a huge thanks also to everyone who's joined us and for your insightful questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to me.
We do all that.
Bye, everyone.